Welcome to this TanStack Router course, where I'll teach you everything you need to know to create type-safe, multi-page applications. And in this course, we're going to start by setting up a new project, and we're going to keep building on it as we go through each lesson. And this makes the course highly practical because this way you can directly apply what you learn, and you always see real-world examples of whatever you're learning. Now, where are we heading with this course? Well, first of all, we're going to see how we can set up various types of routes. And little by little, we're going to build a complete route structure for our application. We'll also build a simple authentication system where we need to log in before we get access to authenticated routes. And by doing so, a new navigation item pops up, which takes us to the Edit Profile route where we can change the username. We'll also learn how to use the built-in data loading feature, which allows us to load data in our routes. For example, in the posts route, it loads a list of posts. From there, we can navigate to one of the posts, which then loads more details about that post. And inside it, we have another route that loads the comments. Now, besides data loading, we'll also learn how to use the built-in caching system. So every time we navigate away from a route, its data will be stored in the browser, so the next time we visit the same route, it will load instantly. And to really understand how it works, we're going to use TanStack Router's DevTools, where we can see which routes are cached, in this case, the post1 route, along with its comments route. There's also a preloading feature, where we can load the data of a route before we even visit it. So here, if I just hover over the second post, then TanStack Router will assume that I want to visit this route, so it will load its data in advance. And if we look under cached matches, we can see that post 2 is cached indeed. And finally, we'll also look at TanStack Router's search parameters API, which allows us to work with search parameters in a type-safe way. For example, in the to-dos route, we load a list of to-dos, and here we're going to use search parameters to filter the to-dos based on whether they are completed. And we'll also implement pagination, where we can, for example, go to the next page. And by doing that, you can see how the URL changes based on the search parameters that are being used. Alright, now before you take this course, there are a couple of things that you should already know. First of all, you need to have a good understanding of JavaScript. Next, you need to have basic knowledge of React. And finally, you need to know a little bit of TypeScript. And it doesn't have to be perfect, a little bit is enough. Before we start coding, let's take a few minutes to discuss what TanStack Router is. Well, TanStack Router is a routing library, and routing simply means navigating to the correct page or view based on the URL. Now, when it comes to routing in React, there are multiple routers to choose from. So, why should you learn TanStack Router? Well, what makes TanStack Router really stand out is that it's 100% type-safe. This means you get auto-completion as you type, and if you do something wrong, like entering a path that doesn't exist, you will get an error right away. So there is no guesswork, no surprises anywhere in your code. And unlike other routers, TanStack Router treats search parameters as JSON. Now, this means you can use arrays and even objects as search parameters, and TanStack Router will automatically serialize them into a valid URL format. And it doesn't stop there. TanStack Router also comes with additional features like built-in data loading, where you can fetch data that is specific to a route, caching to avoid unnecessary requests, a router context, which is for sharing data across all your routes, and just like everything else, it's fully type-safe. Now, there are two ways to handle routing. One is code-based, and the other is file-based. With code-based routing, you write each route yourself. However, in file-based routing, you don't have to write any code. Instead, you create files inside a routes folder, and TanStack Router automatically generates your routes based on your folder structure. Now, TanStack Router recommends file-based routing, and that's why in this course we will focus only on that. To take this course, you need to have Node.js installed. To check which Node version you have on your machine, just open your terminal and run node-v. So I'm using Node version 22. You might be running a different version, and that's absolutely fine, as long as it's at least version 18. If you have an older version, or for some reason you don't have it installed, just head to this link and download the latest version. Next, you need an editor. You can use any editor you like, but I recommend using Visual Studio Code. And if you don't have it, you can download it from this website. If you're using Visual Studio Code, then I also recommend installing the Prettier extension. And the way you do that is by opening the Extensions tab and searching for Prettier. And this is the one we need. And this basically helps us write clean and beautiful code by automatically formatting the code for us. So go ahead and install it. And once you've done that, open the File tab. Down below under Preferences, click on Settings. And in the Settings window, search for Default Formatter. And here you should look for Prettier and select it as your default formatter. Next, search for Format on Save and make sure this option is checked, so whenever you save your file will be reformatted. Now, to start a new project in VS Code, make sure you have an empty folder somewhere on your machine, and then under the File tab, click on Open Folder, then navigate to that empty folder, and finally click on Select Folder to open it in VS Code. To create a new project, we'll open the terminal by pressing Ctrl plus backtick. If that doesn't work, just go to the View tab, and from there you can open your terminal, where you can also find the shortcut key. Once the terminal is open, run npm create vite, then add a dot next to it, and this tells it to create a project inside the current folder. And then press Enter. Next, select React as the framework and TypeScript as the variant. And once that's done, we need to install all the necessary dependencies by running npm install or I, which is shorter. And then we can go ahead and install TanStack Router by running npm I at TanStack /react-router. So press Enter. And once it's done, we need to install an additional plugin. To do that, run npm I -D because we want to install it as a dev dependency. Now the package we need is at TanStack /router-plugin, and we need this plugin for file-based routing and to automatically generate our routes. Now this plugin works alongside Vite, so once installed, we need to add the plugin to the Vite configuration. So let's open the Vite config file, and at the top, we'll import the TanStack Router plugin, and IntelliSense doesn't work here, so let's just do it manually. So TanStack Router from at TanStack /router-plugin/vite. Now let's save the changes. And as you can see, the file gets reformatted automatically, which is amazing. Now next, inside the define config function, you can find the plugins array, and inside it, we will add the TanStack Router plugin. Now this plugin takes an object, and here we set the target property to the string React. And this will make sure the plugin is compatible with React applications. At this point, I assume that you already know that React applications are single-page applications. In case you don't know what it simply means your entire app runs on one single page. So that means when you navigate between different routes, it only feels you're switching between pages, but in reality, everything happens on one single page. So how does TanStack Router make this work? Well, at the core of the router, we have something called the root route. And it's just a starting point of the router where all other routes are nested. And this creates a tree-like structure where the root route is a top-level parent and the other routes are its children. Now, each route also has a route component, and depending on which child route is active, its component gets rendered inside the root component. Alright, now in VS Code, let's start by creating a root route. So inside the source folder, we'll first create a new folder called routes, and we're going to store all our routes inside this folder. Alright, now to create a root route, we simply create a new file. We'll start the file name with 2 underscores, followed by root, and end it with the TSX extension. And by creating the file, the TanStack Router plugin should automatically generate the root route for us. However, right now nothing happens because for this to work, the Vite server must be running. So let's open the terminal and run the command npm run dev. And once you run the server, TanStack Router will automatically generate the root route. And you should also see a message with creating. And what happens is the TanStack Router plugin scans the routes folder, it finds the root file, and then automatically generates the root route. And that's basically file-based routing, where we just create a file and then the TanStack Router plugin generates our route based on the file name. Alright, now let's see what's inside the file. So we have a create root route function, which is used to create the root route, and it takes an object as an argument, and inside it we can add different properties to configure the route. And right now it only has the component property, and it basically tells the router which component to render when the root route is active. And it will render this root component right here. Now remember that the root route is a starting point of the router, so it's always active. And because of that, anything inside the root component is always visible. So we usually use it to set up the main layout of the website, and this is where we add things like a navigation bar. Alright, for now that's all you need to remember about the root route. We will definitely come back to it in a later lesson. Alright, in this lesson, we will finally set up the router. And to do that, in the source folder, let's create a new file called router.tsx. Now inside the file, we'll import create router from @TanStack React Router. Next, we'll call the create router function and pass it an object as an argument. Now inside we can add different properties to configure the router, and what we need is the route tree property, and we'll get into what a route tree exactly is in a later lesson. For now, think of it as a representation of all the routes and how they relate to each other. Now that's what we're supposed to use here, and if we look in the project, there should be a new file called routetree.gen. And TanStack Router generated this file as soon as we created the root route. Now, if we open it and scroll down, we can see that it exports the route tree. And that's exactly what we need. So let's close the route tree file. And in the router file, we'll import route tree from route tree.gen. And then we'll assign it to route tree. And because both the key and value have the same name, we can also pass it directly. Alright, now this will create a new router instance. So we'll store it in a constant called router. And then we should also export it. Now we're going to use the router in our app component. So let's open the app.tsx file and just delete everything. And then we'll create a new app component. So const app. And then we'll export it as a default component. Next, at the top, we'll import router provider from TanStack React Router. And this is the component that makes the router available to the application. Alright, now in the app component, we'll return the router provider component, which uses the router property. And here we should pass the router we've just created. So at the top, we'll import router. And let's scroll a bit down and look for router. All right, next we'll pass it in here. And with that, we're done. Now let's see that in the browser. So let's open the terminal and click on this link while holding the control key. And a browser window should open with our application. And it renders the root component because that's where the application starts. And for now, don't worry about the not found error. We will fix that in the next lesson. So far, we've created our root route, which is where the active child route gets rendered. And now it's time to actually create some child routes. And the first kind of route we'll look at is the index route. And the index route is basically the default route that gets rendered when you visit the website using the base URL. So in VS Code, let's create an index route. So inside the routes folder, we'll create a new file called index.tsx. And as long as vit is running, TanStack Router will scan the routes folder. It will find the index file and automatically set up the route based on the file name. Now let's look inside the file. So this time it uses the createFileRoute function to create the route, and it actually works in the same way as the createRouteRoute function. The only difference is that it also takes a path, which is set to just a /, so it matches the base URL of the website. Now let's see that in the browser. So right now we're at the base URL. So the index route component shows up inside the root component. All right, now besides the index route, we can also have regular routes like portal, which is rendered when you visit the website with its exact path added to the base URL. All right, so let's create this route. Let's first close the index file. We don't need that for now. All right, now let's create a new route. So in the routes folder, we'll create a new file called portal.tsx. Again, the route is automatically generated. And just like the index route, it uses the createFileRoute function. And the path is set to /portal. So now in the browser, to render the portal route component, we just add its path to the URL. So we add /portal. And now the portal route component should show up in the root component. So far we've created a couple of routes, and somehow TanStack Router knows how to organize them into a tree with the root route as the parent and the other routes as its children. Now, we don't have to configure anything. Just by creating the route files, TanStack Router figures out how they relate to each other. But how does it actually do that? Well, when we create our routes, TanStack Router also generates a route tree file. And inside, all the routes are imported. Each route is given an ID to uniquely identify it, along with its path. Now, each route also has a getParentRoute property, which is in this case set to the root route. So in this case, the parent is root, so portal is the child route of the root route. And that's how TanStack Router knows how the routes are related and how they fit into the route tree. And that's just based on how we name the files and structure the routes folder. Now, besides that, it also does a bunch of other things that wouldn't make sense to explain just yet. But basically, it ensures that all routes are typed. And down below, it builds a route tree with all the child routes and their types. Now, this file is managed by TanStack Router, so you should never touch it, because any changes you make to this file will be overridden. So let me show you what I mean. I'm gonna delete everything in this file. Now let me save the changes, and just like that, everything is back. And that's because TanStack Router updates this file automatically, so you should never modify it directly. Also, whenever a change happens in the routes folder, the route tree gets updated automatically. So in the routes folder, let's go ahead and create a new route called profile.tsx. All right, that will generate the route for us. Now let me just close it and then open the route tree file. And you'll see it's already updated with the new profile route. The path is set to profile and the parent route is set to root. Now just remember, for this to work, the Vite server must be running, since the router plugin works alongside Vite. All right? Now there's still one issue you might run into when you try to rename a route. For example, let's rename profile to about, and suddenly the route tree file pops up with an error inside it. So why does that happen? Well, the issue isn't with TanStack Router, it's actually VS Code trying to modify this file, which can cause errors. And one way to avoid the error is to simply close the file and choose not to save it. And that way, any changes made by VS Code won't be written and the error will go away. So let's check it. Let's open the route tree file. And the error is gone indeed. However, a better solution is to make the route tree file read-only, and that will stop VS Code from making changes to the file, and we won't get an error anymore. Now to do that, let me close this file first, and then go to the File tab, and under Preferences, open the Settings. Next, click this button in the top right corner, and this will open the settings in JSON format. Now to open it in the main window, just click on the button next to it. All right, that's better. Now at the bottom, we'll add a new key, which is a string with files dot read only include, and then we set it to an object, and inside it we can add the files that should be read only. Now the file name is routetree.gen.ts, Now we still need to specify where this file is located, and for that we can just add double stars with a /. And that just means this file can be found in any folder at any level. Alright, now finally, we should also set it to true. And once that's done, we can just close the settings. Now let's see if it works by renaming the about route and changing the file name back to profile. And this time we get no errors. And if you look inside the route tree file, you can see that it's already updated. And the file is also marked as read-only, so we can't make changes to it, which is great because we're not supposed to touch it. Alright, so that's fixed, but we should still change a few settings, so this file will be completely ignored by VS Code. And to open the settings window, we can also use the shortcut Ctrl+, and then we open the settings in JSON format. And let's also open it in the main window. Alright, next down below, we'll just duplicate what we have and change this to watcher exclude. And this will basically tell VS Code to stop watching the route tree file for any changes. Now let's paste it one more time and change this to search.exclude. And this will exclude the route tree file from search results. Now close the settings and see if it works. So at the top, click on the search bar and then click on search for text. Now let's just search for profile and notice that it doesn't search inside the route tree file. And that's what we want because we're not supposed to touch that file, so we certainly don't want to search inside it. And this makes it much easier to find what we're actually looking for. Now inside the routes folder, let's open the root route and take a closer look at the root component. So it returns a fragment, and inside it there's a div with the text hello root, and below that we have an outlet component. And the outlet is just a placeholder for the component of the active child route. So what does that mean? Well, in the browser, we're currently on the portal route, which means the portal route is now active. So the outlet component renders the portal component, and that's why we see hello portal. Now in the URL, if I change this to profile, then the profile route becomes active and the profile component is rendered instead. And finally, if we just visit the app with the base URL without anything coming after it, then it renders the index route component by default. So the root component is a parent, and the active child route is rendered inside it through the outlet. And this is also called nested routing, which we'll learn more about in a future lesson. However, the idea is that the active child route is rendered inside its parent route, which is the root route in this case, and that's why the root component is always visible, because the active child route is nested inside it. Since the root component is always visible, it's the perfect place for adding a navigation bar so we can easily navigate between the child routes. But first, we need to get rid of all the default styles. So let's open the index.css file and remove everything. We also have an app.css file, and we can just delete that. Now let's open the browser and all the styles should be gone. And to style our application, we will use a framework called Bootstrap, which is a popular CSS framework that gives us a bunch of ready-to-use CSS classes. To use it, we need to install it first. So inside VS Code, let's open the terminal. And since the Vite server is already running, we need to open a second terminal. And to do that, just press this button right here. Then run npm I bootstrap. Next, we need to import Bootstrap in our main.tsx file. So, import bootstrap /dist/css/bootstrap.css. And this will import the Bootstrap CSS file so we can use its classes. Now, to check if it's working, open the browser and the font should look different now. All right, let's start by building our navigation bar. So, inside the source folder, create a new folder called components. And inside it, we'll create a new file called navbar.tsx. And to work a little bit faster, we can use a VS Code extension. So open the Extensions tab and search for ES7 Plus. And this is the one we need. And it basically gives us a bunch of shortcuts for generating things like React components. So go ahead and install it. And now in the navbar file, we'll use the ravc snippet, which is for creating arrow function components. And it will generate a component for us. And we can also rename it if we want, or just press escape to move on. And it also imports React at the top, but with the newer versions of React, we don't really need it, so feel free to delete it. Now back to the root route, let's use the navbar component. So we'll remove the div here and add the navbar component instead. So let's take a look, and we should see the navbar component. Now let's go ahead and create the navigation bar. So we'll open the navbar file and first remove the div. And then we'll create a nav element with the class name navbar. Inside it, we'll add a logo by creating an anchor element with the class name navbar brand. And whenever this logo is clicked, we want to navigate to the index route. So we'll set the href attribute to the path of the index, which is a /. And for the logo, we will just use text, for example, TSR. Now let's save the changes and see if it works. And it seems fine, but there's a problem, because every time we navigate, the entire page gets reloaded, which is not efficient. And to fix that, instead of using an anchor element, we should use the link component from TanStack Router. And instead of href, it takes a property called to. All right, let's open the browser. And let's go back to the profile route and try again. And note that it's much faster now, because only the route component gets updated and it doesn't trigger a full page reload anymore. Now let's open the DevTools. And under the navbar, you'll notice the link component is really just an anchor tag under the hood, but it has some added functionality. All right, now let's create the other navigation links. So below the logo, we'll start by creating an unordered list and give it the class name navbar nav. And for the navigation link, we'll create a list item with a class name nav item. And then we'll create a link component and give it the class name nav link. We'll set the text to portal. And finally, to tell the link where to navigate, we will use the to property. And right now it should actually show us a list of all possible path names. But we're not getting any auto-completion. And that's because the TanStack module isn't aware of the router, so it doesn't know which routes are available. And to fix that, let's open the router file. And here we need to get the type of the router. So we'll use the type of operator, followed by router. Next, we'll store it in a type called router type. And then we need to register it in the TanStack Router module. And to do that, we use declare module, and we specify the module name, which is @tanstack/react-router. And finally, we'll add a pair of curly braces. And now we can build on the existing module without changing its original code. And we're going to extend the interface register and set router to router type. And just like that, the router is now fully type safe. So let's go back to the navbar and let's delete these quotes. And again, try adding a path to the to prop. And you'll see we now get auto-completion with all the available path names. And the one we need is /portal. Now let's do the same for profile. And we'll just duplicate this nav item. Change the text to profile. And set the to property to /profile. Let's save the changes. And take a look. Now the two nav items are stacked on top of each other. And we should show them side by side. So back in VS Code, inside the list, we're going to add the class name dflex, and this will turn it into a flex container. Next, we'll use flex row to arrange the items inside the horizontal row. Let's check it out. Now we should add a bit of space between the nav items. So let's add some margin to the left of this nav item by using the class name ms-3. Now let's check it out. And that looks much better. Now let's try navigating through the routes. And everything should work fine. Now, instead of just profile, we're going to use an icon here. And for that, we'll use a library called React Icons. And this allows us to import and use icons in our application. And to use it, we need to install it first. So let's open VS Code and open up the terminal and run npm i react-icons. And then go back to the React Icons website and pick any icon you like. Now I've already chosen one. And if you want to use the same, just search for pi user and click on the first one and copy the import statement. And then paste it at the top. And now, instead of profile, add the icon like this. Now let's check it out. And that's working fine. Now the navbar is too close to the edges of the screen, and that's kind of ugly. So inside the index.css file, we'll target the body element and set the padding to 16 pixels. Now let's take a look, and that's much better. So in this video, I'll show you how to style a link when it's active. And to do that, let's first open the navbar file. And then on the link, we can use a property called active props. And it takes an object where we can apply styles or even other properties when the link is active. Now, to add inline styles, we use the style property, which takes an object where we can define all the styles. So let's set the font weight to bold. Let's see if it works. Navigate to Portal, and it should turn bold. Now, instead of inline styles, we can also add a class name whenever the link is active. So let's remove everything here. And instead, use the class name property and add the class name active. So whenever this link is active, this class will be added to the existing class names. Next, in the index.css file, we'll select the anchor tag with the class name active and set its font weight to bold. And this will give us the same result as before. But we don't actually need to add the active class ourselves, because that's something TanStack Router does for us. So let me show you. Let's open the navbar component and remove the active props property. Now in the browser, let's refresh the page and then open the DevTools, and under navbar, look for the portal link, which is this one. And notice how the portal link has an active class along with the data status attribute. Now, in most cases, that's really all you need, and TanStack Router does that for you. So you don't really need to use active props unless you want a different class name or want to add a specific attribute. And as you can see, it's working just fine. However, for the profile route, we're using an icon. So here we need to do something else. And what we're going to do is, we're going to render a different icon when the profile route is active. So let's open the React Icons website. And the one we're going to use is PI user fill. And it's from the same package, so we can just copy its name and then import it next to PI user. And what we're going to do is, we're going to render the filled icon when the link is active and the regular icon when it's not. So now, let's get rid of PI user and instead add curly braces. Inside it, we'll write an inline function, and it receives an object with a property called isActive. This is a property that comes with a link component, and it simply tells us whether the link is active. So when isActive is true, we render PI user fill, and otherwise we render PI user. Now let's save the changes and see if it's working. So let's navigate to profile, and it should render the filled icon. Now navigate away, and it should turn back to the regular one. So far, we've seen how routes can be nested inside the root route, but any other route can have its own child routes as well. For example, the portal route can have an index route, along with other nested routes like posts and to-dos. Now, the index route is a default child route that's rendered when you visit the parent route without anything after it. So if you just go to portal, the index route is shown by default. If you go to portal/posts, the post route is rendered instead. So let's start by creating an index route inside Portal. And to do that, we'll create a new file in our routes folder, and we start the name with the parent, which is Portal. And then we add a dot, followed by the name of the child route, which is index. And we'll end it with a TSX extension. And this will create the route for us. And the path starts with the path of the parent, which is Portal, and then a /. Now we want to render the route component inside Portal. So let's open the Portal route. First, we'll wrap this in parentheses. And then below the div, we'll add an outlet component. And that's where the active child route will show up. Now to get rid of the error, we need to wrap everything in a fragment. Now open the browser. So right now we're at the parent route. So the index route is rendered. Now let's create the two other nested routes. So let's create another file. And we start the name with the parent, which is Portal. We add a dot and then posts.tsx. And the route will be generated, and the path name starts with Portal, followed by posts. Now for the final one, we'll do the same. We'll create a file which starts with Portal, add a dot, followed by todos.tsx. Now inside the browser, when we navigate to Portal/posts, it will render the post component. Now let's try Portal/todos, and it will show the todos component. Now this piece of text shows up no matter which child route you visit. And that's because the active child route is nested in an outlet inside Portal. So anything else in the Portal component, like Hello Portal, also gets rendered. Instead of just having a div with Hello Portal, we should create a menu here so we can navigate between the child routes. And when any of its child routes are active, its parent route is active as well. So the menu will always stay visible and won't re-render when we navigate between the routes. So we can use the Portal route to create a consistent layout for all the child routes. This is what's called a layout route. By the way, we've already created a layout route before. The root route is a perfect example of a layout route. There we had the navigation bar as the main layout of the entire website. Now we're going to do the same thing in the Portal route. So in the components folder, go ahead and create a new file called portal menu.tsx. Now let's use the rafc snippet to generate a functional component. And we don't need this import statement, so let's delete it and save the changes. Then inside Portal, we're going to replace the div with this Portal menu. Let's check it out. And we should have Portal menu here. Now back to VS Code. Let's create the menu. And we'll start by adding an unordered list with the class name nav and nav tabs. Next, we'll create a list item with the class name nav item. And inside it, we'll create a link component with the class name nav link. All right, let's quickly import it. Now we need 3 nav items, so to get this done faster, let's duplicate the nav item twice. The first one should navigate to the default Portal route, so we set the text to Portal, and the toProp to /portal. For the second one, we set the text to posts, and the toProp to /portal/posts. And for the final one, we set the text to to-dos and the to prop to /portal/to-dos. All right, save the changes and see if it works. And here we got an issue. So right now we're at the to-dos route inside Portal, and both the to-dos and the Portal link are active. This is because when a child route is active, the parent route is active as well. And that's why both the links have a bold style. And to fix that, we should add a prop to the Portal link called active options. And it takes an object, and here we simply set exact to true. And this makes sure the Portal link is only active when the exact Portal route is matched. And as you can see, that solves the issue. It's only active on Portal and not on something like Portal/posts, which is not an exact match. Now, to improve the layout, we should add some space between the nested child and the Portal menu. And to do that, let's go back to Portal and create a div with the class name my3 and put the outlet inside it. And this will add margin to the top and bottom of the nested child. And by adding the margin to the parent, all the child routes get the same margin when we navigate. So we use the parent route to define a shared layout for the child routes. Alright, to practice everything you learned so far, I want you to create two new routes under Profile, an index route and an edit route. And after that, you should set up a layout route inside Profile with a menu to navigate between the routes. And to get the most out of this exercise, I want you to use icons for your nav links, which you can get from the React Icons website. Just make sure you have a filled icon when a link is active and an outlined version when it's not. Alright, so take about 20 to 30 minutes on this, and then come see my solution. Let's start by creating our routes. So inside the routes folder, we'll create a file and call it profile.index.tsx. So let's create another file and call it profile.edit.tsx. Now we want to nest the active child route inside the profile route. So to do that, first we'll wrap the div in parentheses. And right below it, we'll add an outlet component. Now we got an error because we still need to wrap everything in a fragment. Alright, let's check it out. Right now we're in the profile route, so the profile index component is rendered. If we visit the edit route, the profile edit component is shown. So that's working fine. Now let's create a profile menu. So in the components folder, we'll create a new file called profile menu.tsx. And here we'll use the rafc snippet. We'll remove the import statement and save the changes. Now we're going to use this inside our profile route. So let's open profile and replace the div with profile menu. Now back to the profile menu component, let's remove this div. And instead, we'll create an unordered list with the class name nav and nav tabs. Inside the list, we'll create a list item with the class name nav item. And finally, inside the list item, we'll create a link component with the class name nav link. Alright, let's quickly import it. Now we need two nav items, so let's duplicate this one. And in the first nav link, we'll set the text to profile. And we will eventually replace the text with an icon. For now, let's make sure this works. Next, we need to set the toProp to /profile. Now for the second one, we'll set the text to edit profile and the toProp to /profile/edit. Now let's see if it works. So right now the edit route is active, so its parent route profile is active as well. So we still need to ensure that the profile route is only active when it's an exact match. So in the first link, we'll add the active options property, which takes an object and we set exact to true. And this will fix the issue. So now that everything works fine, let's replace the text with icons. And for the first link, we're going to use the same icons as before. So we need to import PI user from React icons /PI and also PI user fill. Now below, let's delete profile and then we'll add curly braces and write an inline function. And we pass it an object with the isActive property. Now if isActive is true, we return PI user fill, and otherwise we return PI user. Now save the changes so everything gets reformatted. And for the second one, we need to import two other icons. And you probably have other icons, but I'm using two from the same module, PI gear 6 and PI gear 6 fill. Now let's delete edit profile and do the same as before. Create an inline function that takes an object with the isActive property. And if isActive is true, we return PI gear 6 fill, and otherwise we return PI gear 6. Let's save the changes and check it out. And it seems to be working fine. However, it would be nice if there was a bit of margin. So in the profile route, we'll create a div with the class name my-3 and put the outlet component inside it. And that looks much better. There are two ways to create nested routes. So far, we've been doing that by using a dot between the parent and child routes, and these are known as flat routes. Another way is to create a folder named after the parent route and then put the child routes inside it. And we call these folder-based routes or directory routes. And just so you know, directory is another word for folder. Now both methods do the same thing. However, using folders looks much cleaner because we don't have to prefix the routes with their parent. And it's more organized as well. Now, you should choose what works best for you. I prefer starting with flat routes, and once I have too many nested routes, I organize them into folders. So right now we have 3 nested routes in Portal. So we got index, posts, and to-dos. To turn the to-dos route into a directory route, simply rename the file and replace the dot with a /. And this creates a Portal directory if it doesn't already exist and moves the to-dos file inside it. So let's do the same for the index route. As well as the posts route. All right. Now you might be tempted to put the Portal route inside the Portal folder as well. But don't make that mistake, because then it will be treated as a child route of Portal, and Portal can't be its own child. All right. Now inside profile, we also have the edit and index route. So starting with the index route, we'll rename the file and replace the dot with a /. And now we're left with the edit route, so let's do the same here. And with that, we created a profile directory with edit and index inside it. Now, sometimes we might have deeply nested routes, and we don't want to keep creating folders inside folders. So TanStack Router allows us to mix directory routes with flat routes. For example, to add a route inside edit, we can continue using a flat route like edit.privacy.tsx. And that's how we can mix directory routes with flat routes. Alright, if that's clear, we can go ahead and delete this file. Let's go to the portal route and then to posts. Now, let's say we have a list of posts here, and when we click a post, it navigates to another route where we can see more details about that post. Now, for each post, we can have a route using the post ID, and this ID can be 1, it can be 2, or even 999. That depends on which post is clicked. Now, we don't want to create a route for every single post. And in that case, we can use a dynamic route segment, which is just a part of the URL that changes based on a specific parameter, for example, a post ID. So let's see how it works. Now, we want this route to be nested inside posts. So inside the portal folder, we'll create a new file starting with posts. And we'll just go for a flat route, so let's add a dot. And to create a dynamic route segment, we add a $, followed by the name of the parameter. And we can name it anything we want, but I think post ID is a good name. Now, we want to nest this route inside the posts route. So inside posts, we should add an outlet component. So we'll wrap this with parentheses. And below the div, we'll create an outlet component. Now let's import it. And make sure to enclose it. And finally, we should wrap everything in a fragment. Let's save the changes and open the browser. And now we can add a post ID to the URL, for example, 1, and the dynamic component will show up. Now, typically, you want to show a list of items and navigate by clicking one of the items. So let's start by replacing the div with an unordered list with the class name list group. And inside the list, we'll create a list item with the class name list group item, and then inside the list item, we'll create a link component. Now let's import it. And then inside the link, we'll just add the text post 1. And we still need to use a toProp. And the one we need is this one. Next, we need to assign a value to the post ID parameter. And to do that, we'll use the params property, which takes an object, and here we need to pass in the parameter name, which is post ID. And notice that it gives us auto completion. So it's not only for path names, everything you touch in TanStack Router is type safe. So let's select post ID and set its value to 1. Now this will give us an error because the path name must be a string, so let's fix it by changing the value to a string. Now let's save the changes and see if it works. And when we click the link now, it navigates to post/1. Now let's navigate back and create 2 more list items. And to speed up the process, we'll just duplicate this list item and change the text of the link to post2 and set the post ID to 2. Let's paste it one more time and change the text to post3 and set the post ID to 3. Let's save the changes and open the browser. Clicking the second one goes to post/2 and the third one goes to post/3. And to finish this lesson, let's see how we can access the parameter inside our route. To do that, let's open the post ID route, and inside the route component, we'll use the route object, which gives us access to the use params hook. Now this returns an object that contains all the path parameters for this route. So let's store it in a constant called params and save the changes to reformat the file. And now if we type params and use the dot notation, we'll see all the available path parameters. And what we need is a post ID. Now instead of using post ID as a plain string, let's add the parameter. So add curly braces and put this inside it. Now save the changes and test it. All right. That looks good. Finally, we can also destructure our parameters to get the post ID directly. And now we can also get rid of params, which makes it look much cleaner. Instead of nesting our route inside the post route, it's much better if we could navigate to a separate page and show the details there. To do that, we should change our route into a non-nested route. And we can do that easily by renaming the file and adding an underscore after posts. Now inside the browser, let's first refresh the page. And now under posts, whenever we click a post, it navigates to a separate page. Let's try it one more time. And it seems that it's working fine. Now, how does that actually work? Well, initially, the dynamic route is treated as a child route of posts. And child routes, as you know, are nested inside their parent. But by adding an underscore after posts, we tell the router that the dynamic route is not a child of posts, but a sibling. So it's on the same level as posts. And that's why it's no longer nested inside posts, but rather inside portal. So now inside posts, we no longer need the outlet component. So let's get rid of it. And let's also delete it from the imports. What if we try to visit a route that doesn't exist? In that case, the router renders a component with the text not found. Now, let's see how we can create our own not found component. To do that, in the router file, inside the router options, we'll use the default not found component property. And here we define an inline function that returns some JSX. So let's just return a paragraph saying, oops, page not found. Save the changes and see if it works. And it seems that it's working. Now, to keep this file clean, it's much better to move the JSX into a separate component. So inside the components folder, let's create a new file called notfound.tsx. And inside the file, we'll generate a component. First, let's remove this unnecessary import statement. Next, open the router file and grab this paragraph. And then return it inside the not found component. Now save the changes. Finally, inside the router, we will use the not found component. So let's import it. And don't forget to enclose it. Now save the changes. and it works just fine. Now, instead of passing an inline function, we can also reference the not found component directly like this, which looks a bit cleaner. Now, one important detail here is that the not found component is rendered inside the root route. And that's because the wrong path is entered under root. If we enter the wrong path, for example, under profile, the not found component will be rendered inside the profile route component. So with just one line of code, we can handle incorrect paths at all route levels. Now let's say we want a unique not found component that is specific to the profile route. Then we should open the profile route, and in the route options, just use the not found component property. And to test it, we pass a function that returns a paragraph with page not found in profile. Now let's check it out. And as you can see, we have a custom not found component for the profile route, while other routes like portal still show the default one. Now in most cases, we just want one not found component for all the routes, so we can just get rid of this. So in the previous chapter, we learned how to set up different types of routes. And in this chapter, we'll see how we can use real data in those routes by using a loader. We'll also learn how we can use Axios to fetch data from an API, how to handle loading and error states, and finally, we'll take a look at route masking. So if you're ready, let's get right into it. So let's open the post route. And instead of hard coding the posts, we're going to replace them with real data. And for this, we'll be using the JSON placeholder API, which is a fake REST API that returns dummy data. So down below, you can see that it has resources like posts, comments, and more. And we're going to use a few of them throughout this course. Now, to do that, inside our route options, we'll use a property called loader, and it takes a function. And whenever the route becomes active, this function will be called. And it's specifically made for writing logic to fetch data. And also the loader function is called before the route component is rendered. So this means the data is always available by the time the component is shown, which is a great feature that TanStack Router provides. Now, to get the data for this route, we need to send an HTTP request to the JSON placeholder API. And to do that, we can use the JavaScript's built-in fetch function. But many developers prefer not to use the fetch function and instead use a library called Axios. And that's because it's easier to work with, it has much simpler syntax and more features. Now to use it, we need to install it first. So back in VS Code, let's open the terminal and run npm I Axios. And once that's done, we need to import it in our post route. So at the top, we'll import Axios from Axios. Alright, now inside the loader function, we can use Axios, which comes with several methods for making all kinds of HTTP requests. And in this case, we want to retrieve the data, so we should use the get method. And inside the method, we need to pass the URL of the endpoint as a string. So let's go back to the JSON placeholder website and scroll a bit down to see the available endpoints. Now, the one we need is the first get endpoint called posts. And if we click on it, we'll see that it returns a JSON array with post objects. So let's copy the URL of the endpoint. Next, open VS Code and paste it in the get method. Now this will make an HTTP request to the server, and in return, it will send us back a response. So let's assign it to a constant called response, or just res, which is shorter. Now let's just log the response. So console.log res. Now save the changes and open the browser. Navigate to portal and then to posts. Now let's open the DevTools, and under the console tab, you'll see that it returned a promise. Now a promise is just a placeholder for a value that takes time before it's available. And the thing is, by the time it was logged, the promise wasn't finished yet. So we need to tell JavaScript to pause and wait for the response to finish before we log it. And to do that, in VS Code, we add a wait in front of the request, which then waits for the response before storing it in a constant. And because we're using a wait, the function must be marked as async. And that means it's an asynchronous function. All right, now save the changes, and in the browser, when we refresh the page, it should log the response object, which has all kinds of properties, and the one we need is a data property, which is just an array of post objects. So back in VS Code, let's add a dot next to the response object and take the data. And the data is an array, so let's just log the first element, and for that we'll take the element at index 0. Now save the changes and open the browser, and now if we refresh the page, it logs a post object. Now each post has the body text, an ID of the post itself, the title of the post, and the ID of the user that created the post. So let's go back to VS Code, and if we try to look into the object, we don't get any auto-completion. And that's because TypeScript isn't aware of the shape of each post object. To fix that, above the router, we should define an interface called post, and here we need to define the shape of the post object. Now, we don't need to include every single field, but just the ones we're going to use. So let's take the ID, which is of type number, the title, which is of type string, and finally body, which is also of type string. And when we make a GET request with Axios, we can now annotate the type of the data using angle brackets, and we set the type to post array. And this will tell TypeScript what kind of data to expect. And now if we try again, we should get auto-completion. Now instead of logging just the first item, let's log the entire array. Let's save the changes and open the browser, refresh the page, and we should see all the posts. Now back in VS Code, we can also destructure the response to get only the data. And that way we don't need the res variable anymore, which looks much cleaner. Instead of just logging the data in the console, we should return it, and this will make the data available to the route component. So now in the route component, we can access the data using the route object, which has a hook called useLoaderData. And what this will do is it will return the loader data, which is an array of posts. So we'll store it in a constant called posts. And now we're going to use it to replace the hard-coded posts. To do that, in the list group, we're going to iterate through the posts. So let's add curly braces and iterate over posts using the map function. And for each post, we're going to render a list item with a link component inside it. So let's just take the markup of the first post and paste it here. And then we'll just replace 1 with the ID of the post. So post.id. Now this returns an error because path parameters must be of type string. So let's convert it into a string by using the toString method. Alright, now also instead of post1, we will show the actual title of the post. So let's add curly braces, and inside it we'll add post.title. Finally, to do everything correctly, we should also add a key prop to each list item, and we'll set it to post.id. And we didn't do this in the previous chapter, but it's recommended to keep track of the list items. Now save the changes, and in the browser, let's refresh the page, and we should see all the posts. Now let's click on a random post, and it should take us to its route with the correct post ID. Now let's go back to VS Code and clean up the file by removing these two list items right here.